Hello, welcome to Polyfile. I'm Jeff. Today I'm going to be talking about the differentiation between polyamory and polygamy. Polygamy itself is actually really just a legal concept. You may incorporate a kind of polyamory within it, but really it's about multiple marriages. So in that sense, it's a legal idea. Sometimes it might also be political or economic, depending on the culture you're looking at the time and various ways that marriage was defined within those cultures. Because remember, historically, much of what we think of as marriage was actually about political or economic unity between families. So that actually does change the implication of where this is going. If you want to look at polygamy itself as sort of an umbrella term, there's actually three main different subgroupings within this. There's actually kind of a fourth one which I'll touch on, but there's three main ones. The first kind of polygamy I want to touch on is polygyny. Now this is the practice of one man being married to multiple women. The second one I want to talk about is polyandry. Now this is the practice of one woman being married to multiple men. The third one we want to talk about is the idea of group marriage. So what's the difference between these and why do they exist in these different ways and do they all actually exist? Because a lot of people will say that, okay, well, it's always one man and multiple women, and it actually isn't. Looking around, it's kind of hard to really figure out where some of these things actually existed and when they didn't, because remember, a lot of our history is written about wealthy classes of society. So it's kind of hard to know what is the entire detail of all of the past. We do know that polygyny was a very common idea in many cultures. However, it was not the only idea. It seems, looking now at sort of contemporary examples of these different structures, it looks as though it often has something to do with the availability of resources. So, for example, polygyny tends to occur more often in situations where the ability to control resources, say food, is based a lot on how many people can actually be working the land, because you're looking at agricultural societies. In this case, you'd often see something like polygyny, because if the male was the one who controlled the wealth, because in a lot of societies are patriarchal, and you could then have multiple wives who would also be working the farm like the man would, and also having multiple children with them. So it actually increased the workforce. So this is really why you'd often see this in a lot of environments where resources were plentiful, so long as you had the human resources to harvest them. Interestingly enough, polyandry does exist, and it does exist even in modern times. This is usually associated with environments where resources are tightly constrained. In that case, usually what you want to do is actually just maintain existing control that a family has over the resources that they do have. They want to constrain birth rate and just maintain ownership. So in those cases, it actually would make sense for them to make decisions which actually work against the idea of increased procreation, because that's not in their best interest. Now, group marriage is one which kind of shows up all over the place at different points in history. And it's something which you see a little bit of even today, and that is kind of interesting because that's where you start looking at how it shifts into where polyamory meets up with it. And in that, you sometimes end up in situations where you have a tightly connected group of people who are romantically connected. Now, usually polyamorous arrangements aren't these kind of closed structures. Usually they're a little bit more disconnected. Everyone sort of has their own web of people they're close to. But you do see these closed shapes, closed triads, closed quads, things like that, where all the partners are actually mutually involved with each other. And sometimes in these situations, you will see the notion of a group marriage. Now, of course, group marriage itself is not legally recognized in, say, most of North America or most of the Western world in general. So usually this is something where there will only be one actual legal marriage license. However, because there's a social association of the idea of marriage and being married to someone, this is what becomes appealing for the idea of group marriage between people in that kind of relationship. This, of course, brings us to one other issue that I did want to touch on, which is the idea of bigamy. Now, bigamy itself is actually, it's sort of what happens when someone does have a multiple marriage licenses existing at the same time in a society that does not allow that. Bigamy is more like the criminal definition of what polygamy would be. And this is sort of where, when you have something like people arguing about whether or not it's legal to be married to multiple people, if they're talking about legally married to multiple people, what they're talking about is a disagreement with bigamy law. So these things are all fairly understandable, but obviously they're very different from each other. Polygyny, polyandry, polygamy in general versus polyamory as being more of a polyamory is more of a philosophical concept of how you actually want to run the relationships of people you're connected to, whereas polygamy has to do with more of the legal association of marriage and what that actually means between people in a society, which often comes down to things like liability laws and tax laws, things like that. It is a legal concept, where one's a philosophical concept. This is why associating these two directly or as a de facto nature is very confusing, because they really don't talk about the same thing at all. Really, you start with the idea that multiple people are involved, and then they diverge completely. So being clear about whether you're talking about polygamy or polyamory is vitally important in order to have any kind of discussion about them, because they are very, very different, and they are trying to approach very different ways of looking at things and different problems to solve. You can have them both together or apart, but usually when people are discussing them, they're talking about them apart. Most polyamorous people are not structuring their relationships around the idea of marrying everyone. That's something people might try to do, but it's pretty uncommon in actual practice. They are logically different things, and there's no reason to assume you're doing all of these things at once. Now, I touched earlier on the idea that there's sort of a fourth kind of polygamy, and this is really when you look at how polygamy is defined in terms of zoology, and that's the idea that there's no marriage between insects or something like that. You're looking at it more as what's the actual mating practice between them there. And they'll say, oh, well, it's a polygamous species if it's one that has multiple mating pairs. So in that situation, something which a lot of people probably find kind of uncomfortable, but it's an interesting way of looking at it, the idea of serial monogamy, which exists as a very common idea within Western culture, is actually an example of polygamy in that sense. The idea that you can be married to one person, be divorced, because roughly 50% of people do, and then get married to another person, and then divorce again, because on average, people who get remarry 3 times, and continue. This creates a chain of different households who are all connected by the same partner. And in of course, Western society, this is not gender associated. This can happen in same-sex arrangements as well. There's interesting historical context for that too. But this means that you actually have this idea of multiple different family units all being connected to the same person. Many kinds of polygamy historically were structured in very much the same way. The only difference is one did not necessarily end before the next one began, but the other structures of how people were connected was the same. So it's kind of an interesting way of turning our assumptions on their side and thinking, wait, what exactly is monogamy? How is it different from polygamy? As a philosophical concept, how do these two things play against the idea of polyamory? Where do these things all fit together? And is it really that simple? And why did we need it to be that simple? So, as usual, the different ways of looking at it kind of make us ask questions about our own assumptions about our society and ourselves and our definitions of relationships and what we consider good, fulfilling, healthy relationships with other people. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions relating to this or any suggestions for future talks. Thanks. Bye.